Good morning. My name is Frank Tabch from CommVault. I'm here today to go over some of the, we call it defending big data. So we'll be going over some of the components of big data, how we manage big data, and some of the best practices around the industry to minimize the impact of big data and big content on organizations. So the first part is to talk about big data is really to define what are the domains involved in managing big data. There are three components, three domains of interest when we start defining how big data impacts the organization. The first one is really human-generated data. These are the components that you have in your emails, for example, or Office applications, generating PowerPoints, Excels, all part of the human-generated data. The second one really is process-mediated data. The process-generated data is like POs, for example, for financial systems, or PR, or healthcare type of forms that's really generated from all these content management systems. And the third one is really machine-generated data. There's a spike of talk in the industry around bringing internet to the home. So with machine-generated data, you have all these log files, for example, or you have surveillance system in some of the cities and the counties having all these videos, for example, being generated as part of this whole big data growth within organizations. So looking at the industry in general, 1/3 of the industry participants are really looking at big data as something they want to fix or try to minimize the impact in the next 2-3 years. Another third that's haven't even started doing the implementation to minimize big data. And there's always 10% that's sitting on the sideline without any action yet around managing that particular topic. Fast forward to why we're here today is really, it's naturally the government sector, the government and the local government sector is really the top sector on Gartner's list to minimize or manage big data. Simply because in the local government and the government market is there's a little disposition around records, for example. We're really hesitant to dispose information or apply retention on information within that particular sector. So as you can see with whole data growth, it's really impacting IT spending, for example, and managing the volume of information being generated by this whole big data growth. Looking at the consideration and some of the characteristics of big data, volume not just in terms of terabytes, it's in terms of file types, what type of files we are generating, and how we can analyze these files. Velocity, sometimes the velocity of data really impacts the organization in terms of having a huge amount of data showing up in the environment at a very short period of time and try to scramble to adjust the infrastructure accordingly. As a good example, like I mentioned earlier, is surveillance videos, for example. The growth of storage that really involves in video files or media files is really tremendous on IT as well as on the business aspect of the solution. The variety of data, all the type of data you're dealing with and how you can apply classification on that data. Classification is a huge topic right now, especially in the government market. Try to define and sort this information based on metadata, for example, based on content of these different big data files. And the last one really, it's really a big one around value. How do you define value of the data? How do you extract and analyze this data to make sense of it for the end user? As a good example for that is data analytics. So you have terabytes and terabytes of data. How do you understand the content instead of sifting through all these pages? How do you understand and derive information and value from all this content? And the last one's really, and not the least, is really, veracity of data. Have a trust of that data, and really it touches security. You want to make sure this whole data is secure within the organization. Topics like authentication, access control, encryption, all component of that big data management. It's really around capturing data, going through a process and to understand how data is being flown within the organization. The first one is how do you capture data? How is it coming to the organization? From deduplication, are we minimizing the impact of big data on the organization? Technologies like deduplication. So if you send an email to multiple individuals, or if you have a SharePoint document that's have 15 copies in the organization, how can we keep one copy of it, for example, and with pointers and the chain of custody is maintained within all this data set? Archiving the data around tearing it down. It's using expensive storage, files that haven't touched in over 2 years. How do you archive it? How do you tear it down to different tiers of storage and aligning it with the appropriate retention? The next one is really mining the data. Once you put it in appropriate retention, how do you search it and find information? So search is a really big topic in big data management. So you can go sequentially and flip through pages to find your information, or you can run search. And that touches indexing, being able to index massive amount of data in a very short period of time. In the legal aspect of it, we call it early case assessment. How do you understand the impact of a litigation, for example, by simply running search and finding information immediately to build a strategy from an early case assessment? Collaboration tools, being able to share documents across different departmental organizations. So you can share documents. You can have folders within this big data management, shared across different departments, different organizations, and have a way to define access control within that collaboration. As simple as who can view the data, who can delete the data, who can append data to an actual collaboration folder. And the last two is really analytics and intelligence, being able to have an actionable workflow and have triggers when you see information. So you can have, for example, when you analyze the data that's coming from a particular source, I want you to take the following actions. As an example for that is really automated legal hold or automatic preservation of evidence. As you get data to the organization that have the following characteristics, that have the following metadata, I want you to do this action. And you can have hundreds and hundreds of processes that manages that risk within the organization. So it touches legal, it touches risk management, and all these different processes within the organization. Looking at the valuing information, we call it is everything, is really the top 3 on Gartner's list is around access and valuation of information, which is business intelligence, mobile computing, as well as cloud computing. And they all involve access and valuing information. And this really touches big data management. The problem today is you have all these different processes, whether it's machine-generated, human-generated, or process data. All of them have storage, for example. They have target where they have a workflow that dumps data in a particular target. And sometimes the very same data is really compounded on all these different business processes. So you can have a file that's sitting in multiple buckets of information or workflows. And then you compound that, the data growth on a yearly basis, and you can see how you keep buying storage to let the problem go away, or you can start doing something about it early in the process. Use cases is really what Gartner calls the dark data, being able to find something, make the unknown known within the organization. Looking at very tiny data, it's about quality as well as quantity. So you look at the quality of data, as simple as messaging, for example, IMs, for example. It's really a tiny data, but sometimes it's relevant to manage this whole component of that big data management. So IM, for example, today is part of eDiscovery, for example. Although the impact on it is very minimal from storage perspective, it's very impactful on what you can do with the data from a retention perspective. Offloading to a near-line storage. And this is really the low-hanging fruit in terms of managing storage, right? Take data from the expensive storage and tear it down to a lower tier storage. But the modern way to do it, not just that, being able to tear it down based on the content of these files. So you can say the financial documents, I want them to go to this particular storage target for 7 years. The construction bucket, let's say if there's a bridge construction from the construction department or development department, I want you to be there for 30 years. And I want to put it in that particular tier, or it's cloud, whether it's a tape, whether it's any type of storage target, and replicate it for disaster recovery. Moving and filtering data. As you can see, the cloud is a way to put stuff as a target. but really added another layer of complexity because really from compliance perspective, you're managing data in your data centers, you're managing data in the cloud, on tape, and all these different data sources. Being able to understand the data, analyze it, and the key here is to do culling, right? Get rid of stuff. eDiscovery is about exclusions more than inclusions. You start with multiple terabytes of data. At the end of the day, you're producing few megabytes to the court. So you want to be able to go run through that funnel effect to exclude all these documents that you don't care about in the process. Integrating sources. The biggest part in litigation and big data management is around sources. How do you pull stuff from live systems, from SharePoint, from email, from Exchange, from you name it, all these content management systems. I can list tons of data sources, compliance journals, PSTs. The PST nightmare today is people have PSTs all over the organization. I have a customer calling it walking liability. So how do you manage all this information and include it in that big data management at the end of the day? We touched a little bit on eDiscovery and fraud detection. eDiscovery is the first component, and it's been the case for the last 10, 12 years, simply because there's 99% of organizations have litigation today. And litigation with the FRCP regulation, Federal Regulation of Civil Procedure, it's no longer nice to have. It's a must-have to have litigation readiness for digital assets. So in other words, you can't just print out a stack of emails and just hand it. You have to have integration with the digital system you have, whether it's Exchange, whether it's Lotus Notes, all these different systems that you have in the process. Today, we're going to focus on the unstructured data and the semi-structured data. It's a really big topic, and it really goes beyond the 45 minutes allocated for this session. So I'll be touching mainly on the unstructured data because this is the very first line of challenge for big data today around storage files sitting on the file systems, email growth. You used to have 50 megabyte mailbox. Now you have multiple gigabyte mailbox. So email is a big issue. Files that's sitting on all these file systems, and the storage guys keep buying more storage to let the problem go away. So we'll be tackling that particular topic around unstructured data and semi-structured data. The best way to understand it is really to look at emails, how email really being flown across the organization. This is an example of an actual use case we did at a customer where an email went out to 3 customers, to 3 users. That email was sitting on the local drive and on network file server as well as a local file server. That email also had to be a part of the compliance archive, like a journaling. It's part of a journal. And it's also part of a third-party archive to have a self-service so users can get to their archive and search their archive. That email also had 3 attachments that came from a file server that was replicated across the network. And it's needed for eDiscovery. So they have the eDiscovery application, early case assessment or review tool that's handling that particular files. And it also has a file archiving capabilities for tearing down the storage, as well as content management application. So at the end of the day, all these components that needs to be backed up, remember, backed up and replicated for disaster recovery. As you translate this one, there are 14 products across the organization to manage that single piece of email that went out across the organization. There are 137 retained copies from backup, archive, eDiscovery, and content management within the platform. From information processes, this is from a network perspective, there are 83 activities across the network for that single email. And the last one, not the least, is really the most challenging part for the compliance, legal, and risk management folks. There are 56 copies of that email in the organization. So if you translate that, the reverse around what we call with defensible deletion or retention, you can imagine an email sitting on laptops, email sitting on file servers, on network file servers, on remote locations, and you have to prove to the court, for example, that you don't have a copy of that particular email. So 56 copies of the emails across the organization, emails and files. We call it the parent-child relationship from an eDiscovery perspective. And so the point here is every record in the organization have 10 to 15 copies of it across the organization. And this is the biggest challenge today with big data management and big content. So from defensible deletion perspective, if you, I mean, in eDiscovery cases, prove to the court you don't have your data. If you have 14 copies, it's not enough. You have to have the 15 copies under your control within the organization. Technologies like global deduplication can solve that problem. And I'll show you how we solve that for that particular customer. But the key here is to have a visibility and analytics of all that data that's flown in the organization. The way we look at it from a strategic and modern way for data management around data lifecycle. So define what's active data and what's passive data. So when I go and meet customers and even partners, it's like what's active and what's passive. And this is how you define big data management. What's active, for example, on your systems today, and what's passive. And they have to define what's passive. Could be anything older than 2 years is passive. Some customers older than 5 years is passive. I was talking to a museum, and they keep stuff for 100 years around digital asset. So for them, there's nothing passive. Everything is active. The key here is to see what's below the iceberg. The reason for that is from compliance, litigation, and risk, it's really what below the iceberg that counts. Like, for example, eDiscovery. eDiscovery is about the past, about something that happened 2, 3 years ago. And very rarely it's around what's in the future. So you look at the data, and 75% of the data is really passive data. So you can imagine all this data that's sitting on the organization is sometimes sitting on live servers, that's passive data. So the key here is to tier it down to a lower tier storage. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not just by how many terabytes going on the lower tier, it's what type of data we are tiering it down. So you'll be able to align the departmental data, the topics involved in that data, straight to the actual tier and infrastructure. So you'll be able to have a purpose-driven or purpose-built retention methodology around the data. The key for big data management is proactivity, and you probably heard that in the industry. It's around being proactive. In the litigation world, we call it litigation readiness, but really it's beyond litigation. It's around different business processes. It's around proactivity, doing something with the data before an actual event happens. So if you need the data, you have the power of search under the hood. So if you have a request for operation or for construction or for knowledge management or knowledge capture or compliance, risk, eDiscovery, you name it, you want to be able to tap into that information asset and find your information immediately. Instead of scrambling, trying to build systems to react to a particular event. That can be very costly and repetitive across the organization. And really, to frame the proactivity, you look at the value model by Gartner. They really have to aligned all these different use cases with big data capabilities, from being able to store data, to link it to all these different data sources, and apply analytics on it. And from use cases, and there's a lot more use cases than this, from customer insight to operation to management. Really, I look at it from risk and fraud detection perspective. This is the whole idea of defensibility. So you look at it from risk management, it's around the future, and that's the triggers that I mentioned earlier in the process. So if you have a particular event moving forward, you can set up triggers on the network, for example. Anytime you find the data come into the organization, I want you to take this actionable workflow around it. It's really information governance in action. How do we achieve control? You look at a framework like the EDRM model, Electronic Discovery Reference Model. And this has been around for 10 years now. And if you came from the eDiscovery world, you'd probably be familiar with this model. It's all these linear steps you take to manage the eDiscovery workflow. And you can apply any workflow accordingly. They're all linear models. The problem with these models, these linear models, you have to reinvent the wheel every time you apply a particular case. So in eDiscovery, for example, it's really, eDiscovery is a case-centric engagement. Every time there's a case, you have to collect the data, you have to identify it, you have to go through all these different steps and pay sometimes to reprocess the same data across multiple cases. If you look at this model here, is what we do from big data management is the very first step. Most applications today around eDiscovery, they tackle the middle part around processing, early case assessment. I came from this world myself from 10 years ago, and really it's around the middle part. We focus on early case assessment, how do you index massive amount of data? Very little attention is paid to information management. Information management is the solution to manage this big data from litigation perspective and other than litigation perspective. So you start looking at it from information management around storage optimization, and I touched on that earlier, around tearing down the data. Passive data should not be sitting on expensive storage, for example. Retention and classification. This is a huge topic, especially in the government world. Being able to, I tell the customers, to sort the laundry. You have massive piles and piles of data. How do you sort the laundry? Where are the financial records? Where are the construction records? I mean, I work with airports, for example. They're like, where are our construction records? I want to keep them for 15 years. This is where we built a particular terminal. Where are the utility records? Where are the financial? Where HR records that need to be there for 7 years, for example? Being able to understand the retention and classification as it comes in across the organization. And remember that single copy, that 15 copies, they all need to be considered as part of the classification process. Because you can't retain and classify one copy of it and another copy is still lurking on the network. It's really a liability across the enterprise. The next one is really discovery and workflow. The workflow really is taking data from steps, from capturing that data all the way to indexing it. Then what do you want to do with it? You searched it. Then what? You want to put it in document review. You want to put it on legal hold for preservation. You want to apply classification around it. You want to do something else with it. It could be just exporting the data so you can present it to the judge for the meet and confer sessions, for example. So all these actionable workflow are defined as part of information management. And the last one is really mining and visualization, being able to see who's doing what across the organization. So being able to have data map of all your information asset as it comes into the organization in a proactive fashion. The best way to look at this one is the information governance reference model. You can look at that at edrm.org. Is really where we put the, there are 4 use cases defined for information big content management. From IT perspective, from IT efficiencies, to risk management, to litigation and legal. And the last one is end user interactivity with big data. Use cases, aligning the retention policy. It's all around the retention. Anytime I speak to someone regarding the big data growth or big content growth, whatever you want to call it, I ask about the policy. What's your policy around retention? And some organizations don't have any policy or they're working on a policy. But the key here is to define archiving, for example, or backup, or data protection, or data capture. Put it in policies that you're not really disposing any information yet. Whenever you have that policy, you can flip the switch on all these retention and start expiring document or keeping documents or searching document accordingly. So the key here is to define litigation around eDiscovery, this whole litigation readiness for eDiscovery, defensible deletion. So when you delete your record, you want to be able to report on what you're disposing within the organization. Yes?
Got a question on data destroy. Since you are expert in the data storage field, now the storage is relatively cheap. In your experience nowadays, do any company destroy data?
Yes, actually, I visited customers 2 years ago. They said, we're keeping stuff forever, especially airports.
That's why the data mining is where you have to keep the data for 100 years, maybe 30 years, because you don't know what the data will be used for. You might be used for this purpose today, might be very valuable for other purposes. So I don't see destroying data will be the future strategy for any company. I want your opinion.
It used to be the case 2 years ago, but to be honest with you, this whole conversation is changing the last year. And I'm meeting more customers who are interested in keeping stuff, but keeping the right stuff. So if you have emails about happy birthdays or there's a cake in the kitchen, you don't want to do that stuff. So being able to, that's what, back to the content-driven archiving, for example, or content-driven retention. Financial records, I want to keep them forever, or 30 years. But stuff related to operation, somebody's cleaning the parking lot, I don't want to keep the stuff, unless it's relevant to that particular case. So being able to sort that laundry that I mentioned earlier, so being able to sort through all this massive amount of data at the source, not after the fact. So at the source, you can say, these are HR documents. Let's make sure they're available for 15 years or 20 years. But this stuff, we just want to keep them for 2 years. It's about some administrative stuff, somebody cleaning cubicles. I don't want to keep that for 30 years. The key here is to read age-out document, backup data. I mean, I have customers keeping backups and tapes. Frankly, some of these tapes probably not even good anymore, but they're keeping them in warehouses. And from litigation perspective, we tell the judge, I have tapes, but you want to make sure these tapes are hydrated. They're available for the eDiscovery process. So the key here is to make sure you understand retention, the data targets, the data sources, what you are including in that process. Sensitive data isolation. The legal world, we call it privileged data. This sensitive data needs to be protected with access control, with encryption, and with retention around the right storage. I know there was a big topic in the government market around worm storage, worm targets. Make sure data is read-only. Nobody can modify the data. It's included in that particular retention methodology. I touched a little bit on data classification. This is the biggest topic today around big data management. What do we have in the organization? And this is probably to answer some of your questions is, let's start understanding by aging the doc. This is a policy, right? And really a policy is defined by the chiefs, by the executives. How long are we going to keep our HR records? We have email. What's your email policy? I have customers want to keep email for 90 days. They don't want to keep them for 2 years. Some customers, oh, my emails are there forever. We keep buying storage. So defining strategy, a balance between aggressive retention and aggressive disposition of that particular model. And it's all at the end of the day. Everything sits on storage. Do you want to keep buying more storage and let the problem go away? Or do you want to do something about fixing that big content problem? These arrows really is, if you look at deduplication, are really a way to minimize the growth of data within the organization. So data deduplication have gotten very, very good the last few years. So you can see sometimes, especially with unstructured data, deduplication down to 70–80% of the original data set. So you can start with 100 terabyte. You might end up with 10 terabyte left. So it's really lowering the impact by having a strategy to dedupe the data across the organization. Managing the eDiscovery process, I touched on that earlier, really. It's understanding what's involved from the early case assessment. And this is a big topic between proactive eDiscovery and reactive eDiscovery. Reactive eDiscovery, usually you go find PSTs, rip out computers, and find hard drives, and spend a month or two trying to find the data that you want to index. Or you want to go immediately, tell the attorney, just tap into that web interface, run your search, and find the data. And this is the whole idea of proactive eDiscovery or litigation readiness. The key here is search. Regardless of all the bells and whistles around eDiscovery, it's about searching the data and finding the data almost immediately. I want to find the data around custodians, around date ranges, around certain metadata information, around keywords. You want to tap into interface immediately and run a search across all these different data sources. So as you can go through the list around search, the bookmarks, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. You want a repeatable and defensible methodology around the big data management for the legal aspect. Case initiation, how do you execute your search? Being able to have all these templates around it. Preservation, legal preservation, or a parking lot of data, right? Preservation is a way to save that information in a retention policy that supersedes any policy you have in your organization. So if you keep your archive data for 7 years or your backup data for 7 years, you want to make sure that legal hold preservation area is not affected by the retention policy. So it has its own retention, in other words. You keep it as long as you need it for the litigation process. And you can always revise the legal hold and have a good way to really streamline the eDiscovery process. And export the data. At the end of the day, you want to export the ESI, the electronically stored information, to a target so you can make it available to the court. And again, it's around managing your funnel effect. You start with terabytes of data, you end up with megabytes of data that you want to present to the court. When I worked as a consultant for the Department of Justice, the whole idea is around quality of data, not so much the quantity. We just needed few emails or few files to prosecute. That's the whole thing. It's not about how many terabytes you're managing. It's about the quality of data you are producing at the end of the day. Being able to have a litigation readiness to sift through the data proactively is the key for managing the growth of data from the legal aspect. And if you remember that slide that I had earlier around all these different sources and all these different places to search, the best practices, the modern way to manage it is to have a centralized information governance platform, a centralized bucket of data. It could be a logical story. It doesn't have to be a disk. It can be a logical of disk that's spanning tape, cloud, and disk storage or multiple locations. And you'll be able to satisfy the compliance archiving, the backups, all these different processes that you need from an IT perspective, including the disaster recovery copy. So you'll have only minimum product to manage in the enterprise. So you'll have 2, 3 products only to manage. To have only 5 copies by design, some of them are for disaster recovery purposes. Less processes, less data movement across the network. And very importantly, from compliance perspective and risk and eDiscovery, one place to search. I just want to tap into an interface and find the data. If there are duplicates, I just want to know where they're coming from. You can keep pointers to all the data set. But at the end of the day, this is defensibility in action. Find one place, one neck to choke, one bucket of data that's storing all my information asset across the enterprise. And same thing applicable to processes. You have all these siloed processes, writing data, writing outputs. You want to be able to consolidate them across at the bottom tier for retention purposes. So a document can be utilized by an HR system as well as an operation type of system. Being able to really map all your information asset and have a collaboration for all your information governance platforms. Defensibility starts today around what to do with big data management. And there are some of the objections around from an IT as well as from business perspective. Reasons why is really how do you reduce the data growth? You want to stop that data growth in the organization. Protect data efficiently, being able to move and protect the data. Provide data insight, business insight, because really when you start tearing down data, you can start building your index. Building your index of metadata, for example, or context, or semantic analysis of all the information that you are tearing down. Have consistency and reliability across the network. So if you have a particular search, you want to make sure confidently and proactively that you're searching all your data sources in the enterprise in incremental fashion, not just one-time effect. You can go sometimes real-time, run a search, find all the data, all the emails that you care about, whether it's for legal or other purposes. Tightening risk management, and this back to the trigger that I mentioned earlier, being able to define your risk management within the network, for example. As data comes into the organization, what are the files that are privileged? Where are the attorney-client communication? I want them to go to this particular bucket, and I don't want end users to see it. So you can define risk management and control data flow across the organization. Reuse technology, and this is pretty simple around archiving. You have tier 1 storage sitting, for example, on an Exchange server. Being able to take that old storage and repurpose it for archiving, for example. We don't need the fastest disk for archiving, right? Or for tier 3 archiving. You can take that expensive storage after 2-3 years and just repurpose it. And broadening the scope of eDiscovery. And this whole idea here is around defensibility. You'll have a better strategy early in the process. It's like having an insight of the data. So if you have a case, for example, for eDiscovery, maybe you look at the data from an early case assessment, and right away the attorney, maybe we should settle this case, or maybe we should move forward with the case. Building a strategy, and that's the whole idea of early case assessment or early data assessment around eDiscovery. Simply by being able to find your data, the right data at a faster pace. Sometimes the objection around why not just let the problem go away is really cost justification. The second one is really lack of organizational buy-in. I just want to do my job, just keep buying more storage. And the third one is really lack of organizational alignment. Communication between IT and the rest of the organization, right? Being able to, like data classification, usually it's driven by a record team. Without involving IT. Make sure all these components are integrated. So projects like record classification, eDiscovery, all of them have buy-in from different organizations. There's a little bit bonus slide that really gets to the operational aspect of it. I'll probably go over them really quickly. From an operational and implementation perspective, the key here is to understand the sources, emails, and when I say emails, I mean Exchange, Lotus Notes, PSTs, journals, for example. You can pull data from files, from cloud, from PSTs, from applications, and being able to have reporting and analytics around it. So you collect the data. We collect it, at CommVault we back up the data, but you can call it whatever you want from different vendors' perspective. At the end of the day, you're collecting the data. You can back it up, you can clone it, you can move it to a lower tier storage. You want to be able to have collection, retention, and access for end users. At the very bottom is you want to make sure you have storage at the bottom, but really the best practices is to have vendor neutral type of solution. What I mean by that is you buy your software, for example, from vendor XYZ. You want to make sure if the hardware requires the same hardware from vendor XYZ, this is not going to restrain you from doing changes one day. So the key here for storage and target to have a vendor neutral target for all your information asset. As you go down, really cloud. Cloud is a source as well as a target. Like again, cloud is here to stay. But the key for cloud is to have a good governance of the cloud. You can't let people just throw files in the cloud and you're standing in front of the judge telling him you don't have the document while it's sitting in Amazon cloud or a Microsoft cloud, for example. You want to be able to have governance in the cloud. In other words, you want to be able to index the data, know exactly what's in the cloud, have an inventory of what you're shipping to the cloud. Otherwise, your cloud will be a big challenge and big nightmare for big data growth. Once you index the data, the key here is to whatever you provide is to index the data. Once you index the data, you can start applying classification. And what I mean by classification is not just what's an email, what's a file. It's back to the metadata, for example. What are the files that have the following users, the following executives that related to hiring, termination, and all these different keywords? And I want to align them to classification C. Or, for example, what are the files related to construction that have the following vendor's name? Have the keyword cement, for example, and bridge and construction. I want to put them in a construction bucket called B. So you can start aligning retention and classification based on content and metadata information, not just file type, what's an email and what's a file. A natural way is from, once you start indexing the data, is to do eDiscovery, document review. You can start putting buckets. What's responsive, what's not responsive. And it's all built in a natural progression of search. Search for all the documents that are privileged to our organization. Make sure we're not producing it to the court. Legal hold, buckets, right? It's really a preservation area of information. I want to run a search, find the data that I care about, and grab that data, capture it, put it on legal hold. And I want to do it immediately. I don't want to spend months to do that. You can empower your attorneys, for example, or your HR or whatever business process to grab results and park it in a preservation area. So if we're expiring these records for an IT operational needs like backup or archive, I want to make sure we have these records as long as we need it for the case. Because you cannot delete records if they are under litigation or under legal hold. You want to make sure you have a copy of it in a defensible fashion. You want to maintain the chain of custody of who touched these records in the enterprise. As well as export. Export is just a simple use case. You can have a question from your executive. Find me all this information about these employees. Put them on a zip file or put them on a PST. I want you to take them and do something with them. Being able to export from any type of application. And this is really the modern way of information management. Grabbing records in a funnel fashion and being able to store it and retain it and index it accordingly. The last slide I have is around, just to summarize the steps for managing big data is really being able to define the life cycle around capturing data from different sources and applying deduplication on that data. The second one is to search. We talked about search. Search is the key for managing big data. You have, we used to have, 5,000 records. Maybe you can have attorneys in a room sifting through documents. I'm working with customers who have 15 billion files. How do you imagine searching 15 billion files if you don't have technology to index these files? eDiscovery is a natural progression for search, right? So you'd be able to apply eDiscovery and provide a solution embedded to your enterprise governance, information governance platform. Collaboration is a way to collaborate across the organization. And organization of document around classification for retention needs. So you'll be able to retain big data items based on the content. It's a content-driven retention, not file-driven retention. With that, I'll open it up for questions. Yes?
In your experience, is that problem?
Can you grab the,
sorry. You said part of the key here is actually getting legal and other units to categorize the data and determine when it should be, how long it should be held. In your experience, is that a difficult process, or is that something that is there a way to do that that's more efficient? How do you get the message across that that step is necessary? Because IT really doesn't have a clear idea of how long stuff should be kept.
yeah. If you asked me this question a year ago, I'd tell you it's very difficult. Today, what I'm seeing is a high level of categorization. Some customers, especially I'm working with customers in the state of Washington, for example, in the government market, they have like 155 pages around document retention. But you don't have to get that granular. You can say, okay, keep it high level, right? So you can define the finance buckets, for example. You can define the HR buckets. You don't have to get to employee, hiring, termination. You can just keep it high level by departmental. And once you put it in the high level buckets, then you can give the opportunity to the department to define how they want to categorize the data. So you can recategorize it after the fact. But the key here is to define the high level buckets as you index the data, as you archive it downstream. Any other questions? Great. Thank you for your time. Thank you.